joined this afternoon by Professor Herman Hanko, Emeritus Professor of the Protestant Reformed Seminary in Grandville, Michigan. Professor Hanko taught church history at that institution for how many years, roughly?
I came to the seminary in '65 and my retirement was official in 2000. So what is that, 35 years?
And all that time you taught church history?
Yes.
Yeah, you taught me some of the courses too.
I think I did.
They're very fine courses. Yes. And in connection with his instruction at the seminary on church history, we have these two books that he has penned: Portraits of Faithful Saints and Contending for the Faith, the Rise of Heresy and the Development of the Truth. This book, Portraits of Faithful Saints, is dealing primarily with the good guys, and this one, Contending for the Faith, the bad guys. Oversimplification, but perhaps useful. As I understand it, Professor, both of these books are revisions, developments of articles originally published in the Standard Bearer. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. I wrote a series of articles for the Standard Bearer that resulted in portraits, and then the staff of the Standard Bearer asked me to write another series of articles on the heretics that appeared in the church from the time of the apostles on.
I'd imagine the latter would have taken a bit more research and would have been a bit more difficult. Is that a fair enough assessment?
Not really.
Oh.
I taught, in addition to church history, the development of doctrine, and taught that subject for an entire year. And one of the amazing and yet understandable ways in which God works is to prod His church to develop the truth by the necessity of defending it against heretics that arise and deny the truth. So in the development of doctrine, in the course on the history of doctrine, it was necessary for me to deal in some detail with the heresies that arose. I addressed those subjects in church history too, but dealt with them more in detail in the course on the history of doctrine.
Okay. Now, Portraits of Faithful Saints, I see the introduction was written by Lindsay Williams, and since we're here in the British Isles, I'm curious as to how that came about.
That was my choice. I asked him to write the introduction to the book for me. He was a dear friend of mine, and we were close. We corresponded regularly and saw each other every time I came over to the British Isles. But his vast knowledge of the history of the church in the British Isles overwhelmed me. If he had been in America, I would certainly have invited him as lecturer once in a while to the class. He was one who seemed to me to be ideal to write this book. He understood church history.
Yeah, it's a pity Lindsay hasn't been able to be with us this week.
Right.
And he's, of course, former editor of the British Reformed Journal too. We actually did have him give a presentation in Ballymena on Welsh revivals, and as well as British history. He's very knowledgeable about the Amyraldian controversy, since he knows French.
Yes.
There are timelines as well as some pictures and portraits of faithful saints. Whose idea was it to put in timelines with events, and do you feel it's been helpful?
That idea arose from my copy editor.
Oh, okay.
It was not mine originally. I do think it enhances the value of the book.
Me too. Yeah. Well, 2 of the 52 chapters of portraits deal with people known to you personally: Herman Hoeksema and George M. Oppoff. I imagine those chapters might have been among the easier ones to write, perhaps?
They were indeed. They were my 2 professors in my own years in the seminary, and I unhesitatingly say that I am thankful to God every day for having those two men as my professors in the seminary. They left indelible marks on me. Hermann Henkel was well known, had even an international reputation, and without hesitation I would say he was the greatest theologian, the greatest Reformed theologian in the 20th century. And of course, all the dogmatics I know, I learned at his feet. But Reverend Ophoff, probably an exact opposite from his colleague in the seminary as far as personality and behavior was concerned, I think in retrospect left a deeper mark on me even than Reverend Henkel. And there are two reasons for that. Reverend Ophoff had an uncanny sense of what was Reformed and what was not, and his total commitment to the Reformed faith was a commitment that I have not seen in any other person of my acquaintance, except perhaps his colleague, but from an entirely different point of view. He worked day and night. He killed himself in his studies. He warned the churches of the dangers of a conditional covenant 5 years before it became an issue that finally split our denomination. He warned his colleague, he warned his fellow ministers, he warned his students. He was mostly poo-pooed as being unnecessarily alarmist. He proved to be absolutely right. The second reason, however, why Reverend Ophoff left a mark on me is that, well, let me put it this way, in personal relationships with others, he was naive. Anybody could pull wool over his eyes. And he didn't seem to be in any way in rapport with the persons with whom he was talking. But he had a profound understanding of human nature, totally depraved and regenerated and sanctified, such as I have never met in any other individual. Sometimes he would break away from his material on which he was lecturing for one reason or another. I can't remember the occasion. And he would spend an hour or so lecturing us on some aspect of depravity or some aspect of the work of sanctification. And he would hold us absolutely spellbound. And I remember these lectures, some of them almost verbatim. He lectured, for example, I recall, on what it means that an individual hardens his heart, how that works psychologically and spiritually, how that works. It was totally, totally amazing to me. He understood that. He understood how a man's heart could be hardened. He understood in a way that was biblical, reformed, but profound, what it meant that the flesh and the spirit struggle together in the converted child of God. I have used those lectures over and over again in my own dealings with people of God who are in great straits, in my writings, in my lectures in the classroom. He was sometimes accused of being one of the world's worst professors because he never seemed to make any progress, but He left as great a mark on me as did Herman Henkel. He did.
Very interesting. Now, in your book, you have sections on the early church, the Middle Ages, and Reformation times, and some of the figures laboured in Britain, or Switzerland, or the Netherlands. And you've been to those places, and you're soon, Lord willing, to go to Wittenberg to see the Luther sites. Did that help you in any way to write the book, going to see some of the places where the people lived and where great events took place?
It did. It did. In the old part of the city, in the old city of Edinburgh, for example, the modern city means nothing to me and is something of a total bore. But to go to the grass market where the Covenanters were hung, and to see in my mind's eye the scaffold, and these Covenanters permitted to address the crowd that had gathered before they were hung. And I have a book home of some of their speeches, and to hear them, their voices echoed down the corridors of history, gave me a sense, a feel for the atmosphere of the place that was of enormous help in writing. No question about that.
Do you think in our day that church history is sufficiently known and appreciated?
No, I don't. I don't think that it is sufficiently known and appreciated even by those who confess the Reformed faith. It seems like those who poo-poo the past and say we are living in the 21st century and all that belongs to the past ought to be put in museums where people can pay $5 to look at the relics, are sadly mistaken, sadly so. I think there are, from a purely personal and subjective point of view, there are two things that struck me the most when I was dealing with these saints from the past. One is their willingness to suffer persecution on behalf of the gospel. Not only stalwart, brave men who had learned to endure pain, but fragile, shy maidens who loved the Lord, suffered with incredible courage when their persecutors tormented them and put them to death. There is a shining example in the New Testament of those descriptions that are given to us in Hebrews 11, of men who overcame lions, who were sawn asunder and suffered for the cause of Christ. The other thing that struck me, and this may come as a surprise to many people because I don't know of anywhere where it's mentioned, that many of those who were really genuine men of faith, faithful saints, had godly mothers. Over and over again. You learn that from history. Augustine and his mother, Monica. And others as well. Chrysostom, for example. Their mothers were the ones that influenced their lives. Sometimes when their fathers were even unbelievers, as Augustine's father was. Sometimes when their fathers were godly men, all right, but nevertheless, they didn't have the depth of piety that their wives had. And if anything impressed me, it was what a tremendous role a godly mother plays in the spiritual formation of her children. That struck me again and again. It may be surprising, but it ought to be a word of encouragement to those mothers in Israel who think that their work in the home doesn't amount to anything.
Are there particular figures in church history that you think need to be better known today? Are there names of men that ought to be of particular honour in the church, men that are being greatly overlooked, that today's church needs to grasp and emulate?
Without doubt, Augustine was the greatest of all the church fathers in the ancient period. I have some very important things I want to discuss with Augustine when I meet him in heaven. His understanding of the sovereignty of grace in all aspects of salvation is astounding, absolutely astounding. He believed in sovereign predestination, and not only sovereign election, but sovereign reprobation. And that's denied by the Roman Catholic Church, but denied by Reformed theologians. I have read Augustine. I can quote to you. No, I can't quote to you. I can point you to the passages where reprobation is emphatically taught by Augustine. He died in 430 with the barbarians knocking on the gates of Hippo. How many years is that before the Reformation? Almost 110 years before the Reformation. Gottschalk, who discovered his emphasis on the sovereignty of God and salvation, died at the hands of the Roman Catholic Church, which ironically calls Augustine Doctor of Grace, when they don't mean a thing of it. They put Gottschalk to death in the most cruel way possible, beat him half to death, and then threw him in a cell to starve to death. He never budged from his convictions because he was persuaded of the biblical truth of Augustine. Calvin quotes Augustine in his Institutes of the Christian Religion more than any other church father, and he quotes a large number of church fathers and repeatedly. And I am sure that Calvin was intent on pointing out in his Institutes that his doctrines were not novelties, but that he goes back to Augustine and mines the riches of Augustine and carries those truths forward in his own theology. So, Augustine, surely. In the Middle Ages, I'm struck by Anselm. Anselm was a Roman Catholic to the core of his being. I have a book home on his prayers and meditations. And the struggles through which he went in his soul to attain peace with God remind one of Luther. Only Anselm never attained it. But Anselm understood the atonement as Rome did not. In his book, Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man, he laid down the fundamental truths of Lord's Day 4 and 5 of the Heidelberg Catechism, which quote him almost verbatim. And the doctrine at issue was the necessity of the atonement. Rome taught a partial necessity. Anselm said, no, the necessity of the death of Christ was absolute. No salvation apart from it. And in that howling wilderness of the Middle Ages, Anselm stood for that doctrine in spite of all his weaknesses. I admire him.
Speaking of the Middle Ages, there are a couple of names in here that would raise some eyebrows. Chapter 15, Francis of Assisi. Chapter 16, Catherine of Siena. Would you care to explain their inclusion in this book?
if there has been one criticism of the book, it's my inclusion of Catherine of Siena especially. The criticism was that she could hardly be called a faithful saint. There's a certain justification to that, and I was aware of that when I wrote the original article. But I wanted to get something in the book on what in the Middle Ages medieval mysticism was like. And she happened to be a handy figure for that. And so, probably wrongly, I put a halo on her head and used that to describe medieval mysticism. The same thing is true of Francis of Assisi. I have an idea, however, that if the book were reprinted, I would drop those two.
Well, it takes a big man to admit a mistake every now and again.
You know, we're all prone to error.
Now, in contending for the faith, the rise of heresy and the development of the truth, the companion to portraits, there are names that one would expect. Arius, who denied the deity of Christ and the truth of the Holy Trinity, Pelagius, who attacked the truth of God's grace, and so on. But there are others in there that would raise a few eyebrows. You've a chapter in here on Erasmus and humanism, and one on Wesley. Would you care to address that? Why did you include Erasmus and Wesley in a history of heretics?
Maybe there's a little bit of a personal vendetta there, I don't know. But when I was going to college, and this was, by the way, a Christian college, I was taught that Erasmus was in some respects as great a Christian as Luther. And those who taught me that spoke of Erasmus as being an outstanding figure without whose work the Reformation was impossible to understand. And they hailed Erasmus to the skies because he was an exceptionally fine example of the Renaissance, and the Transalpine Renaissance especially, and the Renaissance in the service of the Church. And all of this led to the idea, of course, that the Renaissance is really the other side of the coin, of which the top side is the Reformation. They were two similar movements moving together in unity with each other, although admittedly the Reformation was by special grace and the Renaissance was by common grace. But the Renaissance proved that the Reformation also had literary, artistic, philosophical overtones that belonged to Christianity. And to his credit, when I was in seminary, Reverend George M. Opoff corrected us on that with vehemence. And he persuaded me that that was biblical. That Erasmus represented a godless, Christ-denying, humanistic, rationalistic development in Europe, which led to all the horrors of modern philosophy in France and Germany, as well as the empiricism in the British Isles, and has succeeded in destroying the true religion. Erasmus, being an outstanding figure in that whole movement, I thought needed some special mention. So I poured out my disgust with the whole idea of the Renaissance and the Reformation being similar in identity and purpose on the head of poor Erasmus. I didn't feel bad about that. Erasmus himself said, I don't have the kind of stuff of which martyrs are made, and he was always walking around with his finger in the wind, finger wetted finger in the wind to determine the prevailing religious and philosophical winds. So Erasmus took a bit of a beating, I admit that.
I think whatever criticisms you make of him, Luther would have been even more severe, and was more severe. He had his number.
I claim Luther on my side.
Yes, definitely.
Yep.
What about Wesley?
Wesley was so Arminian that he could not even tolerate any references to Calvinism. When George Whitefield, his contemporary and fellow laborer in Wales, preached Calvinistic doctrines, Wesley said to him, "I cannot cooperate with you anymore if you keep preaching that stuff." And in his controversy with Augustus Toplady, he wrote a paper that mocked Calvinism and ascribed it to Toplady.
Yes.
In a bit of deceit and falsehood that is abominable. His hatred of Calvinism was intense, and how in some circles he can be called a man of God is totally beyond my imagination. He was more Arminian than Arminius, far more Arminian than Arminius. And he belongs in a book on heretics.
I agree. Doug, can you stand by? Professor, you're continuing the polemic begun by Augustus Toplady, whom you mentioned, who tarred and feathered the old fox, as one of his books put it. And I think you're quite right. He needs it. And one of the great virtues of the book, to my mind, Contending for the Faith, is that it shows the relevance for today of heresies from hundreds or even 1500 or 1800 years ago. It makes the history come to life and shows how this is vital to understanding the church world today. I'm thinking here, for example, of a man such as Montanus. How is he 1800 years ago almost?
Solomon begins his book of Ecclesiastes by saying that there is nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun either when it comes to heresies. Modern day Pentecostalism is only a revival of Montanism, who disturbed the post-apostolic church in the earliest years of his history and taught the same things that Pentecostalism teaches today. Arius, whom you mentioned, who denied the divinity of Christ, reappeared at the time of the Reformation in Socinianism. And by the way, it's very interesting that the Arminianism, so prevalent in the Netherlands in the latter part of the 16th and the first part of the 17th century, became Socinianism, because Arminianism is always incipient modernism. Even the errors of Arius reappeared in New England among the Puritans, the Pilgrims so-called, who settled there and were staunch Calvinists, so that New England today is Unitarian, thoroughly, because of the reappearance of Arius heresy. Of course, there were other factors involved. In my judgment, one of the major factors was that the Pilgrims had an altogether wrong conception of the covenant. That's where they went astray, but that's another matter.
Now, I was pleased to see and found especially helpful the chapter on the Anabaptists. And it seems to me that most Protestants today, so-called, are not actually Reformed, they're Anabaptists. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that completely. The Anabaptist movement is a complex movement because the variety of Anabaptists already at the time of the Reformation was quite great. But nevertheless, that's correct.
In your book you also address the Nicodemites, a group of people, especially in France, who stay out of true Reformed churches and compromise by worshipping with the Roman Catholics, and to whom Calvin addressed many works. I think it's fascinating that these bypaths that are so often ignored are included there. Is that much of an issue today with Nicodemitism?
Well, it takes on a little different form today, but yes, in my judgment, it's an issue because there are people whom I meet and you meet all the time who are ready to agree wholeheartedly with the doctrines of sovereign grace, but who for one reason or another, perhaps often for the same reason that the Nicodemites refuse to come out openly for their faith, stay in their own churches. They will not leave their churches. I know there are other reasons why they won't as well. Whether those reasons are legitimate or not is another question. But they stay in their own churches, even though their churches may be Arminian, Pentecostal, revivalistic, with all the airs of our modern society. They should read Calvin's writings to the Nicodemites.
Then we have Moses Amiro, who claimed to be the true follower of Calvin, and his effect also in France. What would you say about Amyraldianism today?
It's my judgment that Amyraldianism has had its influence not only on common grace and its detestable doctrine of the well-meant offer, but it has had its effect on the idea of a conditional covenant and the resulting error of the federal vision. Amyraldianism was a heresy that arose in France very shortly after the Synod of Dort. Probably was stirring already at the time the Synod was concluding its meetings. And those who promoted Amyraldianism were well aware of Dort's position and developed their Amyraldian position, hypothetical universalism, in the full consciousness that they were combative with Dort, that they were picking a fight with Dort. I'm sure of that. In the Consensus Helvetica, one can find the best confessional repudiation of Amyraldianism that is to be found in any creed. And that was authored by several men, but particularly Francis Turretin. And anyone who is interested in the question ought to read the confession of the Helvetic Confession.
Yes. Now, towards the end of the book, you deal with issues which are very prevalent today, false views. Thinking particularly here of Darwin and evolutionism, prevalent, and then Walter Rauschenbusch and the social gospel. That's pretty much where the liberal churches are today, evolutionary and social gospel. I suppose that's really where it all ends up, the apostasy.
That is correct. Yeah.
Professor Hanko, I want to thank you for taking time out to discuss these two fine books with us. I think these two books will be a great help to many saints, young and old. Portraits of Faithful Saints and Contending for the Faith. Thank you.
You're welcome.